Welcome to the deep dive of Key to My Research, the science podcast by the Excellence Strategy at the University of Tübingen. My name is Jennifer, I'm your host, and in this episode we will take a closer look at the research of Professor Nicholas Conard. Professor Conard is the director of the Department for Early Prehistory and Quaternary Ecology and the founding director of the Institute of Archaeological Sciences at the University of Tübingen. His research combines the analysis of artifacts to better understand the context of late human evolution, including the evolution of modern humans. And he has become worldwide famous for an extraordinary finding in the Swabian Alps, which we will also talk about later. Welcome, Nicholas. I'm very happy to have you here and to learn more about you and your research today.
Pleasure, Jenny. Looking forward to the conversation.
So most people who aren't archaeologists have a rather romantic idea of what being an archaeologist is like, thinking of khaki dress, maybe pith helmets, digging away in the heat. Of course, this is a cliche depicted in film and fiction, but could you paint a realistic picture of what it's like to be an archaeologist?
Well, I don't think that's so far away from the truth in some respects. Pith helmets are not typical attire, but pretty much you can wear whatever you want. On a dig, no one cares. But I've been working in places in Iran or Egypt or South Africa where temperatures get into the 40s. The heat is, or Syria, there's no question heat is an issue. If you're digging in any time in the summer in a lot of those places, even in Germany, it can be pretty intense. But I'm thinking especially hot days in the Fars province of Iran or elsewhere where it really goes over 40 degrees, it's really a big deal. And you're desperate for shade. You have to start at the crack of dawn, take a big break at the heat of the day. So I would say, and depending on where you are, the physical challenges can be very real. I'm very much of a field archaeologist, and I pretty much, not every project, some projects are a little easier physically, but there are plenty of projects where it's difficult. I remember once my daughter came with me to South Africa, and we had to, go across a river, climb a cliff, and do these things that were, I don't want to say extremely dangerous, but a little bit dangerous. And she said, "Wow, I didn't know you do stuff like that." I said, "Yeah, this is how you get to the site." And I can think of many sites where just getting there is very difficult. And so I think certain aspects of those tendencies are real. Also, for a whole range of reasons, I've worked in places that were politically a little sensitive, the anti-Lebanon, the Zagros, but there are a lot of places where not that I look to go to places that are politically sensitive, but there are plenty of places you work where military is present or other things, and to negotiate all of that is sometimes politically interesting. And what's also very interesting about my work is I really go to places where tourists would never in a million years go and get to see a lot of things. And to be honest, I look at my work as kind of like cultural anthropology of people who've been dead for a long time or even extinct. And we go to places that are, from an ethnographic point of view, super interesting, going to places where just no one goes who's a tourist. And I very much enjoy that, and it's exciting. So it's not boring at all.
I believe that. So what would you say is the ratio between being on the field, digging and being on an excavation, and being back in Tübingen doing your research and more the bureaucratic side of the profession?
Well, anyone who knows me will know I'm a horrible bureaucrat, but I'm not such a bad scientist. I would say it depends. It would not be far from the truth to say digs are going on all year round. In the semesters, which of course here, the fall semester starts the middle of October and goes until middle of February. Most of that time I'm here. And then also the summer semester, which goes from the middle of April until late July, most of that time I'm in Tübingen. But during those times, for instance, tomorrow I'm going to Hohlefels to go to the dig, and I try to go a couple times a week. It depends on the time of year. There are digs we have, such as at Schöningen, that begins March 1st and goes until Christmas. So just that dig goes 10 months. I'm obviously not there every day, but I go as much as I can. And then particularly interesting for me are the foreign excavations. So every year in South Africa, depending on the year, 6, 7, sometimes 8 weeks in the field, really digging. I've got very good crews, so sometimes people go ahead of time, get things set up, sort out the logistics, and then I come for the real excavation. So what I would say is for the international digs, whether it's in Tanzania, South Africa, Iran, before the war, Syria, I would be digging those days, 6 days a week with my own hands. But for a lot of the German digs, I go. I'm obviously very involved in what's happening, but unless I can have a week to work on the excavation myself, I go and direct the excavation, but I'm not in the trenches. So it depends a lot, because you can't, if you're in the trenches, you can't just come and go every half day. You need to be there for days and weeks on end to really make progress. But the good thing is we have a great team for all of these projects.
Yeah, sounds interesting and very adventurous.
I think it actually might be more adventurous than some people would think, certainly more adventurous than some members of my family had thought.
So you're a specialist in the study of Paleolithic archaeology. What fascinates you about this specific period of human prehistory?
Well, if you think that our genus Homo has been around for at least 2.5 million years, and the Neolithic, the beginnings of agriculture, depending on where you are, start 10,000 years ago, a little bit later, a little bit earlier, almost all of human history has been in the Paleolithic. And that's a period where humans lived through hunting and gathering and collecting all sorts of foods, fishing, many other things, but without any real systematic agriculture, in most cases without serious storage for long periods of time, and where I would never say that in the sense of living hand to mouth that people were on the edge and they were just surviving. I wouldn't mean that in that sense, but people did live primarily on what they were personally able to collect or kill, process, and eat themselves. And I would say today we're so removed from all of that, right? We just go to the store, we go to the market in Tübingen or wherever we are, and most of us don't do any serious agricultural work. Most of us don't have that much to do with the fish or animals or any of the products we have. And so we're just consumers. And for almost all of human history, people were much more engaged with subsistence, and all of the technology you need to do that were things that most people could do. And that's what shapes who we are anatomically, mentally, and what most people consider normal today is really highly abnormal when we consider human history.
Do you think we have anything in common with the Paleolithic cultures?
Well, I think, Jenny, when you were born, you did. And if you were born in, let's say, the Swabian Jura 40,000 years ago, you'd be fine. You'd just grow up with the Aurignacian people, these early modern people who lived there. You would obviously not know the difference, and you'd figured everything out. It'd be no big deal at all. You'd be like everyone else. But for you to go back to the Paleolithic now, I think you'd manage. You'd look pretty clever and healthy, but you'd have to learn a lot. You'd have to learn many, many things. How to make fire, how to tan hides, how to hunt and collect and make fires and all sorts of other things. And so I think, I don't know, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think A, you would make it, and B, I think after you learn the language and how to do everything, I think you might enjoy it. It'd be, here, the modern world is characterized by, everybody's in a big hurry, right? Everybody's got appointments, time is money, everybody's stressed out about everything. And back then, I really don't think it was like that. I think there was a lot of time just to engage with the world around you, the people around you. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there were times where things got rough. You could also have complex social interaction and many other things. But in general, this hectic life that we have today, would be very different.
If you could beam yourself back, what questions would you ask the Paleolithic humans?
Well, I think I would just watch. And I think watching how people were living, what they were doing, how they were interacting, would probably answer a lot of my questions. And then depending on what I observed, I might have specific questions. Why do you do this? Why do you do that? But, some people say we don't know so much about the past, but I like to think a lot of the information we have is there to figure out how people lived, how people thought, how people interacted with one another. And I feel actually pretty close to these people through all the stages. I'm not saying that I've got all the answers, and certainly I would learn a lot by being able to go back and see how, let's say, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthal societies interacted with one another, and to what extent, for instance, fully developed communication about the past, present, future. If there were, for instance, artistic expression, song, dance, things like this before modern humans, things like that, I could probably figure out just by participant observation using cultural anthropological terms and keeping my eyes open. That would be super interesting. But what I think one would find is, for all of these time periods, just like today, right, if somebody asks, well, how do modern humans live? Well, it makes a big difference. Are we talking about people in the Kalahari? Are we talking about people in New York? Are we talking about people in Tübingen? It depends. You can't answer that question and say, oh, modern humans do this. Modern humans do a lot of different things depending on their cultural background, the physical background, and I'm sure that was true for Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, and everybody else. So I think what we would need to do is get a lot of detailed information, contextualize that, and figure it out case by case. And then after doing that, it might be possible to generalize a little bit and say, oh, well, here's some robust differences. But I would say, based on the archaeological record, which we have for many regions, sometimes with a high resolution, we have a lot of information on this. So I feel pretty comfortable at least making some statements about how people lived in the past.
Mm-hmm. So you just talked a bit about the methods. Obviously, we can't beam ourselves back and observe the peoples, but what are the typical methods you work with today to get your information, get evidence of certain developments?
Well, I'd say if you were going to an area where no one's ever worked, which I've done a number of times, then the first thing you need to do is engage with the geology and the landscape. So if you want to find material from a certain period, the first thing you need to know is, where are there sediments of this age? It's not chance that the department I'm in, early prehistory and quaternary ecology, is part of the geosciences, and that's because the starting point is always going to be geological. Also, when you think of these early periods, it has direct connections with human evolution, and human evolution is really the same thing as human paleontology, which came out of paleontology in the 19th century. And hence, whether we're looking at the evolution of mammals or dinosaurs or whatever, we have to find skeletal material, in our case cultural material, and try to then piece together how the biological evolution is occurring, in the case of humans, how the cultural evolution occurs. And that is a gigantic puzzle at many, many levels. But let's say, where do we dig? That's the first question. And usually we conduct surveys over large areas, say an area 10 by 10 kilometers. That could take a few years, depending on the situation. Some places are a little bit easier. I'm thinking of Iran, Syria, parts of South Africa, where there's very little vegetation. And so you just walking over the landscape, you can read a lot of what's happening by the artifacts on the surface. Often, but not always, we work in caves. Caves often give the benefit of trapping sediments. And if you're experienced, you can get a pretty good idea of what kinds of sediments one could expect in different situations. If you're digging in open air settings, you need to know where sediments accumulate, which are often low-lying places. But you don't want to be in a place where sediments are, let's say, washed down a hillside and everything's jumbled up. It's much more interesting to work, for instance, on lakeside deposits or streamside deposits, or I've worked on craters of volcanoes, all sorts of things. And so, let's say, to get started, you really have to engage with the geology.
And how was it in the case of the Venus of the Hohlefels? I mean, how did you locate her?
Well, the other thing is, once you decide where you're going to dig, you embrace the process. And what I would say is, sometimes people are in a hurry. And it's very rare that I'm in a hurry. So this is the 28th year in a row we've dug at Hohlefels. And I do remember people sometimes ask me, well, what would you like to find? What would you hope to find? For me, that's not really the question. For me, the question is, what's there? And what if it's there, we will find it. And it's embracing the process and the excavation, making up some sort of hypothetical things that maybe would be interesting, Neanderthal cemeteries or this or that, is pretty much irrelevant. And I would say we always dig, in the case of Hohlefels, 28 seasons in a row. Before my phase of the excavation, people had worked there for decades before. So it's a very long-term project. And the amazing thing is every single year so far, we've had amazing discoveries. And I would say it would be pretty close to the truth that every single year, my highest expectations were, exceeded. And what I also think is important is that I deal a lot with students or people with less experience, and they're sort of often chomping at the bit, right? And, really want to get started and go, go, go. And, after a couple of hours, they're like, well, I haven't found anything or nothing great or nothing that's going to change. That's the completely wrong way to go about it. It's
so
always
trust is the most important trait you need as an archaeologist, would you say?
Well, you need to just be calm and embrace the process, right? If you're learning to read, you don't start with, Finnegan's Wake or Thomas Mann. You first learn to read Dr. Seuss, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, or something like that. And then gradually you can engage in serious literature. And if you're going to be an archaeologist, you don't just go and find the Rosetta Stone or gold or King Tut's tomb. You can be lucky at times, and certainly I've been lucky more than I've been unlucky. But in general, you put in the work, and if you're smart about doing the work, the reward will come.
So can you tell us a little bit about the significance of the figurine you found? I mean, it's extraordinary. Can you just sort of put it in a nutshell why it's so extraordinary?
Yeah, Jenny, I can do that. But I guess what I would say is I don't even like focusing on the finds themselves. Of course we can do that, and I will do that. But on all of these excavations, for instance, we've dug for 11 years under my direction at Zebudu in southern Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal. Within the next week, Zebudu will almost certainly be named a World Heritage Site at the World Heritage Convention that's going on right now in New Delhi. And at Zebudu, we find also amazing things, right? I won't go into all the details, or at Schöningen. So to say, archaeology boils down to the female figurine from Hohlefels, or a flute from Hohlefels, or a mammoth from Vogelherd, it's great that people are excited about these things, but it's just a really the smallest view into the past. But if you want to know about the female figurine from Hohlefels, yeah, it's amazing because it's about 10,000 years older than any other figurine of this kind. It's from the Orignatian period, the first period of modern humans in our part of Germany, in southwestern Germany, along the upper Danube. And it was found at the base of the Orignatian layer, would have an age of approximately 40,000 years. What's also super interesting is the left shoulder and arm are missing, and we just 70 centimeters from where we found most of the figurine, we were digging, looking for the left shoulder and arm, and the most complete flute made of a griffin vulture radius, a wing bone, came out. Right next to it. That's like, oh my God. And these are all things that were pretty much considered close to unimaginable. And female figurines typically come from the next period, quite a bit later, called the Gravettian, which might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 years, depending on where you are. And this is something, the female figurine from Hohlefels is somewhere closer to 40K. And what's also interesting is that it has a whole range of very specific features. If you'd like, I can describe it and tell you what I think or how I would interpret it, but I need to go into a little bit of detail.
Yeah, that would be my next question, talking about your interpretation.
Yeah.
If you'd like to just present it briefly.
Yeah, I'll try. Well, the figurine's a little bit over 6 centimeters high, and when you interpret Paleolithic art, and especially these ivory carvings that we have in significant number from the Swabian Jura, you have to realize it's made of a hard material, ivory. And carving ivory is a very demanding job. You do it with stone tools. And every single line or marking has to be deliberate. It's not like you're on the phone and on hold scribbling with a pencil on a piece of paper. Everything requires active engagement. And that's the basis for any interpretation. So you look at a piece and you say, well, what is depicted and what is not depicted? And then I would use that as the basis of saying, well, what's depicted must have been important to the people. What's not depicted must be unimportant to the people or person who made it. So the first thing, if you know the figurine, there's no head, right? So that tells you a lot to begin with. If there's no head, no face, right? If we ever see each other after this interview, you'll recognize me because of eye contact, because we know what each other look like. Without a head, I would never recognize you. You would never recognize me. So I would say we can be sure this is not about an individual woman. So that's one thing. Another thing is there are practically no legs and there are no feet at all, right?
Stocky arms, right?
Well, the arms are, I'll get to in a second. But the feet, and the feet are completely missing. The legs are little pointy things. It's completely clear that locomotion, movement, walking, running is irrelevant. That's not what this is about. And then you look at the figurine. It's not rocket science. You look, what are the characteristics? A highly pronounced pubic triangle, very pronounced vulva, very full breast. Often people say, oh, it's a pregnant woman. It's not pregnant at all. In fact, the stomach's very flat. I think it's a woman who just gave birth. And what's also interesting is, while the feet aren't depicted at all, the hands are depicted in great detail. I don't know if you know the figurine, but I'm not a woman. I've been around for births, but I was thinking, she's got their hands on the upper part of her stomach, underneath her breasts. Like, I feel like after a really good meal, I don't know if it's like that when you give a baby, but but the hands are right there, and you can see every finger in complete clarity. And if you're taking care of a newborn baby, doing it without feet, without running around, might be possible, but without arms and fingers and hands would be pretty tough. So I think it's a woman right after giving birth. There are a lot of other details we could talk about, but I would place the figurine much more in the area of, let's say, midwifery, information about giving birth, something much more in the female realm of life than other things. And I would also connect that with the idea that we're dealing with early modern humans in the Danube Valley, in a situation where the worst thing that could possibly happen to a group is losing mothers, right? If you were losing mothers to death or serious injury in childbirth, that would be horrible for the demography, horrible for the group at many levels. So taking care of women in their reproductive years, making sure births go smoothly, that mother and child remain healthy, are really, in some ways, even like today, right? You can tell a society is in pretty bad shape if they're not taking care of their mothers and children. And I think that this falls much closer to that range. Healthcare, women's health, midwifery, things like that are the central issue. And another thing to consider is art in general is not one-dimensional. You would never look at, if you go to a movie and it's a real, just completely linear movie with no depth, there's nothing to talk about. You'd say, hey, Jenny, what do you think of the movie? You'd say, well, that was a really pretty crap movie. And if almost anything you read, you go to a museum, you go to church, you'll see that there are multiple layers of meaning. And so I would say one layer of meaning is human reproduction. But you can also imagine, depending on the time period, but 40,000 years ago, we're in the middle of the Ice Age. We're in a landscape filled with mammoths and reindeer and horses, woolly rhinos, completely cave bears, lions, a totally different situation that we have today, much, much colder. And you spend a good part of the winter living in a cave like Hohlefels. You probably have a very rich social life, right? Probably much more time for conversation than we have today. But then finally, spring comes, the birds start singing, the grass, everything's flowers bud, and the bushes and the berries and all these things come out. And the way we enjoy spring after usually in most parts of Germany, not a terribly harsh winter, you would have there in a much, much more intense form. And then imagine you personally collect the food you eat, you kill the animals, your relationship to the natural world would have been so much more intense than ours. And so fertility, fecundity, is not something restricted entirely to human reproduction. It takes place within a much broader context in the natural world. And I would place the figurine also in that area. So fertility, fecundity in the general sense, not only in the sense the mother needs to be healthy, the kid needs to be healthy.
Mm-hmm. So You were just talking about the symbolism of the figurine and symbolic communication in a bigger sense. So, what other depictions would you find in this age? Or, I mean, what is a subject matter you'd find in art in the Paleolithic?
The subject matter is typically, if one were to generalize, animals. Depends a little bit where you are in the world. In a bit later time periods in Southern Africa, in Australia, there are a lot more depictions of human beings. If we stick to Europe, the subject matter, as I think many listeners will know, is often Ice Age animals. Right? Think of Lascaux, think of Chauvet. Very few human depictions, but lots of depictions of cattle, of reindeer, of mammoths, of lions, of bears, all sorts of things, right? So that's the main thing that's depicted. One can discuss why. There are many, many ideas about that. I would say I cannot give you a definitive. I actually feel much more comfortable about talking about the female figurines than telling you what the animals mean. But I would also say the animals represent many things. And one thing we can be sure of is if you are interacting with mammoths, rhinos, horses, lions on a daily basis, you know a lot about them. That is for sure. And you see that in the drawings and the carvings and everything, that there's an extreme intimacy with the animal world around them. And then it's important to at least think about that we live in a scientific age where when we ask a question, well, why does the sun come up? Why does the winter come? Why does someone live? Why does someone die? We were just raised to think of that from a scientific perspective. And a lot of spirituality, a lot of religious ideas have really, in many parts of at least, let's say, society in Germany, fallen by the wayside, right? We look for scientific answers to things in a period where all of the world around us was a much more spiritual, much more, broadly speaking, divine subject matter. The idea of myth and connections with the animal world, that the animals were alive. You interacted with them at a physical level, a spiritual level, also the landscape, right? The stream flows and whispers to you, the rocks and the wind and everything sing and communicate with you. Life would be very much richer in that sense. Obviously a bit poorer when it comes to natural science and hypothesis testing and things like that, but in many ways a much richer life than we have today.
So these figurines and carvings and mythical depictions in the caves, they're basically an early form of art. But I read that you're not too keen on discussing the definition of art. How come?
Well, it's like many things. There are many ways of defining it. We have a lot of these questions with religion. Some people would say, especially people trained in the science of religions, they often come up with very strict definitions, right? You need permanent tasks, officialdom, and very strictly regimented ceremony and things like that. And I think there are many, for me, I would tend to view it in terms of beliefs, how we look at the world around us, and not focus so much on the, let's say, technocratic, bureaucratic aspect of how the religion's organized. And I personally would say any modern human, whether it's 40,000 years ago or today, especially in a hunter-gathering environment, definitely had religious beliefs, myths, an ideology, a way of looking at the world. I think that is very, very close to universal. I don't think there were many atheists, right? But some people wouldn't accept the religions of hunter-gatherers as even being formal religions. I personally would. When it comes to art, I always tell a story. I was walking up the hill to the castle in Tübingen with Elizabeth Kiefen, someone I respected a lot. She was the chair of art history. And I was saying, well, Frau Kiefen, maybe we could give a class on Paleolithic art or do something together, because she was in art history and we had these early figurative depictions. And the topic came up. And I think I asked her, well, how do you define art in your field? Because in my field, we say if it's something that somebody carved or painted, we just say it's art, right? It's just a very loose definition. And she said, well, Herr Conard, I wouldn't lose a moment's thought about that, right? Some people say Michelangelo or other people were just doing contract work paid for by somebody. It was just practically craft at the highest level for money. And other people, spit on a canvas and call it art, right? And I think there's some truth to what she said, and I took that to heart. I'm not going to really engage seriously with people on how we define art or how we define religion. I'm happy to talk about the topic, but I'm not going to be super focused on the specific criteria we use to say, this is art, this is not art. I think art's a very fluid term. I think in our own lives it is. And I personally don't feel any need to put it in a small box and say, this is art and this isn't art. More importantly, in my own field, all of these kinds of depictions, what we see in Grotte Chauvet, Lascaux, and many other sites, we call that in my field art, and no one would question that the Vogelherd figurines are art, and for us, that's true. When we get to, let's say, markings, right, then we get into areas where one can debate whether these non-utilitarian markings should be classified as art, but I really don't find the classification in and of itself the critical point. I would say, what's going on with these markings? What is it telling us about life in the past? That would interest me much more than how we define specific terms.
Mm-hmm. And talking of the role of art in the past, what role did it play in the Paleolithic?
Well, I think it depends. Right? One of the most common or most well-known forms that we have here in southwestern Germany are the lion men. Mm-hmm. Right? There was a lion man excavated in 1939 by Robert Wetzel from the University of Tübingen, one dug in the 1970s by Joachim Hahn at Geisenklöstle in the Ach Valley, a lion man from Hohlefels. It's actually the only one of these artifacts I found myself, which I have a particular or let's just say I remember finding it very clearly because I said, that's a lion man. Wow, that kind of blew me away. I'm not very easy I don't get excited on digs very easily, but when I saw the lion man, I thought, wow, because it was very clear to me that if you have one lion man, at first it's just weird, right? Why is there a depiction of a man and a lion in one object? But if you find it 3 times in 3 different sites in 2 different river valleys, and they're limited to this area, then we're getting very close to proof of a system of beliefs.
There's a pattern behind it.
There's obviously a pattern behind it. And so that is super interesting. It's like Jesus on a cross. You find one, you say, well, that's funny, a man on a cross. One. Yeah, and then you find 3 at 3 different sites, then you know something's going on. And so, for instance, in that case, we talked about the female figurine, and we actually have 2. Also very interesting with the second one, we only have a breast. And if you look closely, you see what looked to be, I'm not 100% sure, but 90% sure, the tips of the fingers, right? So it's only 2 little pieces. And I keep saying, well, where are the rest of the pieces? But we haven't found them yet. But with the lion men, one can debate the details, but it's very clear that in this period, approximately 40,000 years ago, a transformation between the regular human world, our level, our tactile, real world where we have our senses, we interact, we can touch each other, we can listen to each other, that somehow this is connected with some kind of other world, a nether world, where people and lions are fused, and that there's a fluidity between the animal world, the human world, and that's often brought in connection with shamanism, which is, again, a way of transforming into a spirit that can move into a spirit world and address problems or learn things that could be useful for people in the regular world. But this fluidity of our empirical, let's say, real world that we would consider a real world and the spirit world must have been part of life there. And that I'm very confident about. What exactly the details of the connection between, let's say, in quotes, the real world and the spirit world are, that is something one could debate at great length, and there's a lot of speculation on that, but I can't give you a definitive answer on that.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think man started creating art rather than sticking to tools and, so to say, useful devices? How did art come about? How did it emerge?
Well, that gets us into the social sciences, the theories we use in the social sciences. And so what I would say, although there are multiple ways of looking at it, in human evolution, we usually use an evolutionary paradigm, broadly speaking, coming from Darwin. And if you use that point of view, you would always say, well, okay, human life is characterized by a lot of variation, and there's a selection of things that are useful. And if you approach it from that point of view, you fairly quickly come to the conclusion, interesting. Every group of human beings we know today, well, they have speech, they have song, they have dance, they have music, they tell stories, and they have art. So these characteristics that we can identify 40,000 years ago are universal, which suggests very strongly that people who have these capabilities made it, and the people who did not make it. Otherwise, we obviously wouldn't be on radio or wherever we are on podcasts, because none of that stuff would exist, right? So there must have been an advantage by entering deeply into the symbolic world. In biological terms, how do you define an advantage? An advantage has to be a biological advantage. If it doesn't lead to successful fitness in Darwinian sense means giving birth, having the offspring survive, having them survive. So if you have an adaptation that doesn't help your fitness, then the group's going to die. And we have so many examples of hominins in the past that are extinct. And in fact, this is the only time in all of hominin history where we only have one species, Homo sapiens. So while Homo sapiens is pretty diverse, in the old days, things were much, much more diverse and I would say in some ways exciting, at least from a scientific point of view. 50,000 years ago, we definitely had lots of Neanderthals, we definitely had Denisovans, we definitely had Flores people, and probably some other kinds of humans also on the landscape that haven't been identified yet. And today, all living people are Homo sapiens. We maybe have a little bit of a genetic addition of Neanderthals, all of us about 2%. Some people have a bit of Denisovan in them. And all of these things are super interesting, right? Well, I find that fascinating to think about. But to get to the point of art, music, symbolism, all modern humans have it, and it must have been useful, must have given the people who had it an advantage in terms of survival, fitness, reproduction, in comparison to the hominids who didn't have it. Mm-hmm. And Neanderthals, Denisovans, Flores people, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, these are all groups that had very little, or there was very little evidence of symbolic artifacts. With Neanderthals, there's a bit more evidence, but it seems like there's really a significant increase about this time. And what's also fascinating, colleagues here in Tübingen work on the genetics of these early modern humans who made it to Europe after evolving in Africa 300, 200,000 years ago. And the first people who made it here died out, have no genetic contribution to us as far as we know, and they lacked figurative art as far as we know, music. And then when these things kick in, Neanderthals go extinct pretty shortly afterwards. So that's one way of looking at it. But there are also other ways of looking at it that, if we have time, I'd happily elaborate upon.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I just have one more question to the topic of the spread of these figurative arts and tools. So basically, I read that they spread very quickly across much of the globe after their first emergence. And it seemed like a bit of a trend. So how did it go viral back then?
Well, I think that's a really important point. The earliest evidence we know about comes from Borneo and Sulawesi. They're new discoveries. I think we need to be a little patient because the date, it all hinges on the dating, and I'd like to see sites dug where we have artifact assemblages. Colleagues from Australia are working on this, and I hope they find it. It's a bit lonely, I always think, having these very early artworks. Why wouldn't they be elsewhere? So I'm cautiously optimistic that the evidence will continue and show that we're seeing similar patterns of evolution, for instance, in Borneo and Sulawesi. When we look at the European record, where we have a lot more information, what we can see is that the earliest findings are, in fact, from 4 sites in the Swabian Jura, in the Lona Valley, Hollenstein-Stadel, famous for the Lion Man, Vogelherd, here on display in Tübingen with lots and lots of artworks, musical instruments, etc. And in the Ach Valley, most of the materials shown in our museum in Blaubeuren, we see numerous examples of ornaments, which are super important for symbolic information about our own identity, figurative representations. We talked about lion men, female figurines, and several beautifully preserved flutes. In other regions, the record of this is much less developed, sometimes because of the history of research. One also needs to remember that we're working here in the Swabian case, we have really good preservation. So if you don't have good preservation, you can't find these things anyway because they're not there. And then if have the good fortune to have the preservation, then you have to know how to do the excavations, how to find the materials. And if you look around, you see a little bit after this 40,000 year date, we start to see similar things pop up. The most famous example found 30 years ago was Grotte Chauvet, an unbelievably important site in the Ardèche with beautiful panels. When Chauvet was discovered, nobody believed it could be 35, 36, 37, 38,000 years old because it was so perfect. Interestingly, with the carvings of the Swabian Jura, people said the same thing. Oh, this can't possibly be the beginnings of art because it's too perfect. And, I studied chemistry and physics and geology and things. I don't really care what people think or want to think or don't think. I would always say, well, what can we demonstrate and prove? And the proof is that these early artworks really are unbelievable. They're magnificent. Let's just look at the paintings in Chauvet. And gradually, through systematic study, we've been able to show that. The colleagues at Chauvet have shown that. And the subject matter on the cave paintings of Chauvet found 30 years ago overlaps significantly with the kinds of depictions we have, with mammoths, horses, and many other things, lions that are typical here, even a female depiction. And then what's interesting, if you go to northern Italy, you find monochrome red depictions that are much more schematic. If you go to southwestern France, you find engravings, often, let's say, simplistic depictions of animals, often vulvas scratched into the stone. And you can see that at a very early date, you see a pretty wide range of depictions. And then after that, all of this starts to grow, and as I mentioned before, it becomes a universal trait. And what's interesting is before this period, about 40,000 years ago, with the possible exception of the Sulawesi and Borneo materials, you don't find any convincing examples of figurative art. So it really does seem to spread quickly. And one would then assume that it tracks pretty closely the biological success of modern humans.
So how would you describe your taste in design and aesthetics in contrast to the art the Paleolithic had?
Well, I'm highly biased, but I find the art we've discovered at my side is about as good as it gets, right? I mean, look at the Vogelherd mammoth or the fish from Vogelherd, or I love the lion men, but also the water bird from Hohlefels. I love all the pieces, the musical instruments. These are, I think, really spectacular artifacts from any perspective. If you're talking in a broader sense, that's a bit
Talking contemporary.
Yeah, contemporary. I think that's, I like so many different kinds of art. I could be, well, let's begin with more classic things. I mean, who would not like, Rembrandt, Vermeer, or Michelangelo? Well, I have a lot of images in my head, but I can't think of the top of my head where I would really say, "Oh, this blows me away." My sister's an artist, okay. And I like going to her shows in Ohio and seeing all the people there. And sometimes I see, the local artists, some of them famous, some of them less famous. I say, "Wow, this is amazing." So I have the people I know, like my sister, and some of the people in these circles really have spectacular things, and I'm a little hesitant to, off the top of my head, go too deeply there.
And do you do art yourself?
I'm horrible at it. I have very few skills. I can't sing very well. I can't play any instrument. My drawings I can do okay technical drawings, but they're really largely uninspired. I can mechanically get it done. I used to think I might want to be an architect. I'm capable of doing mechanical drawing and let's say technical drawings. Yeah. But I would say in any kind of creative arts that I have zero talent. Maybe writing, I can write okay. And if I wanted to, let's say more journalistic rather than creative writing, although I might write a poem now and then, but I would say if I were artistic, it would be much more with the written word.
If you would be artistic.
If I were, yeah.
Let's talk about the things you do. What other things do you do in your free time other than, apart from your profession? Like, do you like going traveling? Do you have any hobbies, so to say?
Yeah. I like reading. I like contemporary politics. I travel a lot for my work, so I'm kind of happy when I'm in Tübingen. I live in the old city. I like lots of things. I play. I'm not so bad at sports. We had the Archaeological Tennis Championship of the world on the weekend.
Wow.
As far as I know, there's not one. And with my doubles partner, Marius, we won.
Congratulations.
On the departmental football team, on the other hand, finished 28th of 32 teams and was particularly pathetic this year. Although in the European Football Championship, we did much better in Oxford. So I would say sports.
Must be the good British air.
The British air in Oxford helped us. Well, we used to be very good at. Now we've slipped from the top to somewhere. Germany say oberes Mittelfeld.
Okay.
And but lots of things. Here, punting in Tübingen on the river is fabulous. I like cooking. I definitely like shopping, cooking, domestic life. I would say I wouldn't say I'm a professional cook, but I definitely eat 3 square meals a day, and I usually prepare it myself. And what could be better than that? Of course, like everybody else, cinema. I was at a theater piece last night. I'd like to do these things more, but of course, when possible.
Sounds like a healthy lifestyle of the modern human.
Well, I hope so. I mean, different strokes for different folks, but I'm happy with my life.
Talking about happy, how happy are you at the University of Tübingen at the moment?
Well, I'm hesitant to say this because people might think I'm lying, but I'm not. There's no place I would rather be. I live in the old city. I walk up the hill to the castle every day, and literally every single day when I walk to work, which is really just a few hundred meters, I look over the Neckar to the Swabian Jura, and I think this is breathtakingly beautiful. And I've been at many, and where I work in the castle is spectacular. I have a vineyard at the castle, do a fair amount of gardening, do all sorts of things. And what I noticed is, I got my PhD at Yale. I was there recently for a fellowship, and I realized I just wasn't getting much done, right? We have so many emails, so much day-to-day routine work. And I think one reason I'm very productive is that I just lose no time. I just walk to work. On the way home, I go shopping, and everything's so easy today. There's markets on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and just really a stone's throw away from where I live. And all of these things are just so easy. Coming here on my bike just takes really just a few minutes, and that's typical of everything I do. And I notice when I go away, even to fabulous academic institutes, my work environment always gets worse. And so, speaking for myself, there's no better place that I could be for my field. And on occasions, I've had job offers to go elsewhere, and I've never even considered it.
And what makes the University of Tübingen an ideal setting for you as a scientist? So we've talked about the city, about the lifestyle, about being in the fresh air, about short distances. But what is it about the academic location?
Well, I'm from the States, and in the States, you virtually never, a budget for a university budget, right? You almost never have staff in fields like mine. And we have a good budget, staff, technicians, colleagues. So at a typical, let's stick with the US, a typical American university, you would either have no one in my field or maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3, perhaps, but it'd be unlikely. And here we might have 25 people with PhDs working in my field. What's also amazing is education here is free. That is the most amazing thing, right? Where I'm from, you pay, tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to get an education. And here, it's essentially free. If you're a German citizen, a EU citizen, and even if you come from elsewhere, it's inexpensive. And I think the outside world is starting to realize that. In Tübingen, we had to start what we call a numerus clausus, limit the number of archaeology students coming. We're the only university, as far as I know, in Germany that has done that in archaeology, because we're getting too many students from all over the world. And I think the attractiveness of the studies here, also the artifacts, the museum that we have here, whether it's the Paleontological Museum, the Archaeological Museum, even the art museums, there's so many things that are really spectacular. And again, for me personally, I can't imagine any reason to go. And in fact, I came in 1995, and I imagine when it comes time to retire, I'll probably stay around.
So I'd have one last question, last but not least. What would you say is the key to your research?
The key, I think, intelligence, perseverance, commitment, of course, a little bit of luck, but I really don't think luck is the key thing. I think the key variable is knowing what you're doing and enjoying it. And I think that's true for everything. That's what I always tell the students. If you enjoy what you're doing, everything will go fine. If you don't enjoy it, you should probably go into a different area.
Change profession.
That's what I would say.
Thank you, Nicholas. This has been a very interesting deep dive, or rather deep dig, into a very special topic. Thanks for sharing all your stories, your facts, and giving us insights into the emergence of modern behavior. This was Key to My Research, a podcast produced by Changing Time in cooperation with the University of Tübingen. You can find information and the links to the sources in the show notes below. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and recommend it to your friends and colleagues. My name is Jennifer, and I'm looking forward to see you next time.